There's a scenic overlook in West Virginia where, on a clear day, the view is genuinely beautiful. People pull their cars over, they photograph the river far below, the mountain, the still water, held back behind the dam. Almost none of them know that the water is there because 90 years ago, men dug a tunnel straight through the mountain beneath their feet, or that hundreds of those men are buried in an unmarked field a few miles away. The view is beautiful because the tunnel worked. And that's the whole problem. In 1930, the country was sliding into the Depression, and a company called Union Carbide wanted cheaper electricity to feed its own metal plant. So, through a subsidiary called the New Kanawha Power Company, it set out to build a hydroelectric plant in the mountains of West Virginia. The plan was elegant: drill a tunnel through Gowley Mountain, divert the new river through it, let the falling water turn the turbines. The work went to a contractor, Reinhardt and Dennis, on an aggressive 2-year deadline, and the contractor needed men. It was the Depression. Men were not hard to find. Nearly 5,000 worked the project. Almost 3,000 of them went underground. At least 2/3 were black labourers from the South, drawn by the promise of steady work. On paper, it was progress, a river tamed, a region electrified, jobs, in a year when there were none. Everything about it looked reasonable. That is usually how these stories begin. The work was simple, and it was brutal. Drill into the rock, blast, haul out the rubble, drill again, and do it fast. The faster the tunnel advanced, the more the contractor was paid. So the men were driven hard. West Virginia law said you waited 30 minutes after a blast to let the dust settle. They were sent back in immediately. When they hesitated, the foreman drove them with pick handles. The air turned white. Men could not see 10 feet in front of them. The gasoline engines hurling out the rock filled the tunnel with exhaust. Sometimes the trains collided in the dust. Now there was a known way to keep that dust out of the air. You drilled wet. You ran water through the drill, and the dust never lifted. It was standard. It was understood. In some places, it was already the law. It was also slower, so in the tunnel they drilled dry, and then the company found something. The rock they were cutting was not ordinary rock. It was silica, nearly pure. To the men choking on it, that meant nothing. To Union Carbide, it meant a great deal. Pure silica was valuable in its metal making, so the company made a decision. It would not simply dig through the silica, it would mine it. About a third of the tunnel was widened for no reason but to harvest the rock. More cutting, more blasting, and more dust. The dust that was killing the men was no longer a byproduct of the work. It had become the product. And here is the detail that should not be possible. The project had been licensed as an engineering job, not as a mine, so the dust laws that protected miners did not legally apply. They were mining. On paper, they were not. The men breathed the difference. When company engineers went into the tunnel to inspect it, they wore masks. The workers were given none. Silicosis is usually a slow disease. It can take years to close a man's lungs, sometimes decades. What happened in that tunnel was not slow. The dust was so fine and so thick that men developed the acute form. Only 40% of the underground crew lasted more than 2 months. Only 20% made it past 6. Young, strong men grew short of breath, then bedridden, then dead, sometimes within the year. And when they fell sick, many were told they had tuberculosis or pneumonia. Anything but the tunnel. How many died is a question with no clean answer. The company admitted to 109. The congressional hearing of 1936 counted 476. A later study, by a physician named Martin Cherniack, put it at 764. A federal study estimated close to 1,000. Some believe it was higher still, and here is the part that tells you everything. No one knows for certain because no one in charge thought it was worth counting. Many of the dead were black migrants, far from home, and in that segregated time, they could not be buried in the white cemeteries. So the contractor paid a local undertaker $55 a body to bury them in a field, on a farm near Somersville. No markers. For 40 years, no markers. Their families were often never told. Eventually, there were lawsuits. 538 of them. The out-of-court settlement was $200,000 for everyone, together. Individual awards ran from $30 to $1,600. White families were paid more than black families for the very same disease. A generous share went to the lawyers. The largest trial ended in a hung jury, with evidence that the jury had been tampered with. In 1936, Congress held hearings. A subcommittee described what had happened as a condition hardly conceivable in a democratic government in the present century. They were not wrong, but still nothing changed. Silicosis was acknowledged. The precautions stayed optional. The work went on. The easy lesson here is that industry used to be dangerous and that we have come a long way. That lesson is comfortable, and it misses the point entirely. Here is the real one. When a danger becomes profitable, the institution stops treating it as a danger. It converts it into a cost. And if that cost can be pushed onto people that is already decided replaceable, then the arithmetic becomes very simple. The horror of Hawk's Nest is not that no one knew. They knew. Wet drilling existed. Ventilation existed. Masks existed. The precautions were cheaper than the funerals. But the funerals were not paid by the people who made the decision. Today, the tunnel still runs. The dam still holds. The water still turns the turbines, exactly as it was meant to. And above it all, there is that overlook. People still stop their cars. They still take their photographs. The view really is beautiful. It is beautiful because the tunnel worked. The men who made it work were buried in a field a few miles away. In 1972, those graves were finally moved, not to honour them, but to widen a highway. Next time, another story about people who sat down, did the arithmetic, and decided it was cheaper to let someone else pay.